When I was a kid growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the 1950s, I'd eat breakfast at the kitchen table before walking over to Mark Twain Elementary, and I'd flip on the radio. Because of the time of day, I'd frequently get the same show. And I remember the announcer would come on and would always say, "And now, speaking for God and against communism, is the Reverend Billy James Hargis." And the Reverend Billy James would come on and would denounce that communist infiltration that was destroying America. He would denounce those pinkos who were assisting the communists. And he would especially denounce the Democrats, all of whom were just one short step away from treason. I had a friend at that time, and I'd walk over to his home a few blocks away and go into the living room and sit down on the sofa and reach over to the Swedish modern coffee table and pick up the magazine that was lying there. Soviet Life magazine, straight, 100% pure Soviet Union propaganda. My friends' folks were on the left. The FBI snooped around their neighborhood, questioning the neighbors, went to their workplace, asking more questions, looking for proof of what they knew, and that is that my friend's mom and dad had taken one short step into treason. That was the 1950s, a time of enormous political divisions in our society. Much of America obsessed with communist infiltration, and much of America terrified that the FBI would pound on their door next. But I'm told that today, the divisions in our society are far, far worse than they were in the 1950s. That today we have become completely polarized, and it is paralyzing our government. Some years later, in 1970, I was a soldier in Vietnam. And one day in May of 1970, my buddies and I turned on Armed Forces Radio just to catch some rock and roll. And that day, we didn't get rock and roll. We got a news broadcast that said there had been 4 days of demonstrations against the war on college campus in Ohio. And the governor of Ohio had called out the National Guard to restore order. They did. They shot 4 students dead at Kent State that day. The irony of this just swept over me and my buddies. Here we were in Vietnam, in the war, listening to a war taking place on a college campus back home. That was the 1970s, a time of immense political divisions in our society. There was a strong anti-communist pro-war America, and there was a strong anti-war protest America in the streets. But I'm told that the divisions of the 1970s are nothing compared to what you and I are living through today. That today we are polarized, that our politics has become completely polarized. My name is Wally Knox, and today I want to talk to you about the polarization of American politics. And what I'm going to say may surprise some of you. It may actually offend some of you because the truth is that polarization is a myth. We have not polarized. There has been some immense changes in our political structure, but polarization is not what is happening in America. So we're going to look at that discussion and analyze whether or not America truly has polarized. Look, I hear what you hear every day. You simply can't turn on the television or go to social media or pick up a newspaper, if you pick up newspapers, and without being told over and over again that we are a polarized nation, that we have separated into a left that is rigorously left and a right that is obstinately right, and there is no room for agreement between them, and that this polarization is paralyzing our government. Everyone agrees on this. MSNBC agrees with Fox that we are polarized. The New York Times agrees with every other periodical that we are polarized. But few people ever stop to analyze, is it true? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do four things. We're going to clarify our terms. What the heck is polarization? Exactly. Secondly, we're going to look at our ideologies, our political beliefs. Are our beliefs what has polarized in America? Third, we're going to look at our political party structure. Has our political party structure polarized? We're not going to do this by taking one snapshot. We're not going to quote one poll taken in October or November of 2020 and say this poll reveals everything we need to know about American politics. Rather, we're going to use the American National Election Survey, which has been conducted since the 1950s, asking the same questions of Americans over and over and over again in order to track our political history with great care. There's a fourth thing we're going to do. We're going to say that polarization truly is a myth, but we're also going to examine whether or not that myth is harmless, a harmless urban myth, something we got wrong, but it has no consequences. And what I'm going to be saying is very clear. Polarization is a myth, but it is a dangerous, dangerous myth. So let's move to number one. Let's clarify our terms. When we're talking about polarization, what are we talking about? Back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, this is what our political views looked like, the distribution of our views. We had a left over here on the left, we had a right over here on the right, but in the middle, we had this broad American middle. That was the center that kept us stable, kept the left stable, kept the right stable, kept the entire country stable. That is what was the glory of American politics in that era. We are told that that era has vanished, and we are now a polarized nation, as you can see down here. The left has swelled in numbers, the right has swelled in numbers, and the middle, the broad middle of American politics that used to be there, has vanished, completely vanished. That's polarization. Polarization means that the middle has vanished. Now, here's another thing we can learn from this. Polarization doesn't simply mean that we have political divisions and disagreements in our society. Back in the 1950s and the 1960s and 70s, we had enormous political divisions. We had a left and we had a right. And down the middle of the left and right, everyone to the left of the middle was somewhat on the left, moderately so or fervently so. Everyone to the right of that middle was somewhat on the right, moderately so or fervently so. But the middle, that moderate middle, moderated the extremes of that. What we are told is that today, the divisions have created a complete divide. There's nothing left in the middle. You cannot find a voter who's in the middle. We either are on the left or on the right. So let's move now to the second point. How do we start to assess this? Well, the first thing to do is the simplest possible thing. It's a question I ask you now. Are you a conservative, a liberal, or a moderate? And that's the question the ANES has asked every American it interviews since 1972, over and over again. And let's see what they found the answers to be. Wow, this is not exactly what I expected to see in a polarized America. Let's go back to 1972. That big green line at the top, that's the percentage of people who said they were moderates in 1972. 55% of us, absolutely dominant. And you can see as time goes on in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, all the way over here to 2016, it does decline. It goes from an absolutely dominant 55% down to a merely dominant 44%. And under that big green line is the red line, conservatives in America. And you can see that the percentage of conservatives has increased, and liberals likewise. The percentage of liberals has increased somewhat. But moderates remain by far the largest single group of Americans in political beliefs. That's simply not what polarization is supposed to show us. Polarization should show that the green line had vanished and the red line and the blue line both had soared into complete dominance of American politics. It simply doesn't appear in this. So maybe there's something else. Maybe it's not our ideologies which are polarized, but it's our party structure that is polarized. Democrat, Republican, or independent. What do you think of yourself as? A Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? Where do you fit in American political structure? Let's take a look at our structure since 1952. Now, once again, this doesn't instantly look like a polarization of American politics. Look to the left of this graph all the way back in 1952. The largest single political group in America at that time was that big blue line at the top. That was the percentage of Americans who said they were Democrats. And you can see at the time John Kennedy was inaugurated in 1960, it hit 46, maybe 47% of Americans said, I'm a Democrat. Way down below that, that red line floating in at 25, 26, 27% of Americans in 1960 said, I'm a Republican. And even further below that is that tiny green line back in 1952. Those are folks who said, I'm neither a Republican nor am I a Democrat. I'm an independent. And in 1952, it was a pathetic 20% of the American politics said they were independents. That's the center that should vanish as America polarizes. So as America polarizes, we should see the green line collapse even further, go from 20% down to 0. And we should see the blue line and the red line soar as Americans chose sides between being a Republican or a Democrat. It didn't happen. Instead, the blue line, the Democrats, declined from its high of well over 45% in 1960 down to about 37% in the 1990s, paused for a while, and then in the 2000s began to descend once again. It's beginning to approach the 30% mark in America, down enormously from its high point. The Republican Party, the red line below that, has fluctuated between, call it 24% and 27%, but has never been more than 30% of the American public in recent times. Those are the two parties in American politics. The green line, the independents, the center that should not exist, expanded between 1960 and 1980 from 20% to almost 37% of the American public. And then it stabilized itself for several decades. What's fascinating to me is, in recent years, if you look past the year 2000, what's happening to each of those three lines? The Republican line continues to fluctuate between high points and low points. The Democratic line began to decline, and the independent line began to grow once again. Independents today are passing the 40% mark in American politics, the largest single group politically oriented in the United States. That is not polarization at all. That is simply not what we are told is going on. So let's just pause for a second and try to absorb this. If our ideologies have not polarized, and if our political party structure hasn't polarized, something else has happened. Maybe there have been some other structural changes, but those changes simply did not take place. Then polarization is a myth. And maybe we should just all relax because everything's hunky-dory and there's no real problem. It's a cute, strange urban myth that we can all dismiss. Well, what I want to say to you is, it may be a myth, but this myth is a myth with enormous consequences. The consequences stem from one thing. We all believe the myth. Democratic activists believe that they represent almost over half of America. And Republican activists believe that they represent over half of America. After all, look at the election results. Every time the two parties get about half and about half. So clearly, the American public has divided into camps that completely support the Republican platform or completely support the Democratic platform. And the myth tells the Republicans and tells the Democrats there's no reason to compromise, because 2 years from now, you'll have another election and you'll have another shot at getting complete dominance of the American political scene. And once you do that, you'll have over half the American people with you, and you can do whatever you want, completely implement the programs you have always wanted to do. The myth of polarization encourages fantasizing among Democrats and fantasizing among Republicans. And it goes further than that, because the independents in our American society, the 40% of Americans who are independent, believe the myth as well. They have no understanding of the dimensions of their size, and they feel alone. Every independent feels like they are a lonely island floating in a sea of hatred in America. The myth of polarization can be immensely destructive. Well, the other thing we're told about this is that the center, which we've discovered exists, doesn't really matter. Of course, there is a center. We found that in our ideologies. And of course, there is a center. We found that when we looked at our party structure. But we're told that it simply doesn't matter politically. It doesn't determine the results of the elections. We just had an election in 2020 with Joe Biden elected president. And the commentators immediately got on the radio, got on the television, and began saying the same thing over and over. This election proved once again that America has polarized. Both political parties turned out their bases, and it was a contest between the size of the base on one side and the size of the base on the other side, and the Democrats won this time. Polarization is complete in America. Well, let's take a look at the election results and see if that holds up. Did the center play a role in the 2020 elections? Oh, the overall results are these. Joe Biden in 2020 won the overall election by about 7 million votes. Among independents in America, Biden also won the election by 5.25 million votes. A huge portion of his margin came from independents. That's interesting, but it is completely startling when you realize that in 2016, Donald Trump won the independents by 1.6 million votes. No other group in American politics of any dimension shifted its allegiance this massively from 2016 to 2020 between the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate. But we all know that the elections do not select president based on the national vote. It's the Electoral College that really matters. And Joe Biden got 306 Electoral College votes and was elected president. Did the center, did the independents play any role in that victory? We'll look at 3 states. We're going to look at Arizona, we're looking at Pennsylvania, and we're looking at Wisconsin. In Arizona, with 11 Electoral College votes, Joe Biden won the state by over 10,000 votes, not much at all. Among independents, Joe Biden won by 372,000 votes in 2020. That is even more remarkable when you realize in 2016, Donald Trump carried the independents in Arizona by a margin of 29,000 votes. So in other words, independents by almost 400,000 shifted their allegiance to the Democratic Party in 2020. Arizona, would have gone to Donald Trump if independents had not supported Joe Biden. Pennsylvania, with 20 electoral college votes, Joe Biden carried by 63,000 votes, but he carried the independents by a larger margin, 109,000 votes, which is more extraordinary when you realize in 2016, Donald Trump carried those same independents by 82,000 votes. Independents shifted their support from one party to the other by about 200,000 votes. And finally, Wisconsin, this is the same thing. I'm not going to be repetitive here. If independents had not shifted their allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic candidate, Biden would not have won Wisconsin. Without Arizona, without Pennsylvania, without Wisconsin, Joe Biden would not be president. Donald Trump would be. So what we've gone through has shown us a few things. You can't find evidence of polarization when you look at our political ideologies. You can't find evidence of polarization when you look at our political party structure. Nor can you argue that the center doesn't matter in American politics. The center, the independents, the center that doesn't exist, elected Joe Biden. Now, if you want to get more into this and to learn more about polarization and the debate going on in America about polarization, I'd encourage you to read two remarkable political scientists. Morris Fiorina, political scientist at Stanford and fellow of the Hoover Institute. He always jokes half his salary is paid by liberals and half his salary is paid by conservatives. Fiorina is the major theorist opposed to the polarization theory. The book to read is Unstable Majorities. And Alan Abramowitz, a distinguished political scientist at Emory, is foremost proponent of the polarization theory. His book is The Great Alignment. In coming episodes, we're going to continue to discuss the future of America's political parties. We're going to discuss why it is we all believe the myth of polarization if it simply isn't true. And we're going to discuss what is going to happen to American politics as a result of all this. Next time, we will continue to explore the implications of the myth of polarization.